So welcome back for the final session of the workshop, which is kind of brings us back to where we started off with the zoo as a cage, or animals on stage and in cages at the zoo. And we have two presenters, Matthew and Andrew. I'm very happy to have you both here. Matt, it occurs to me that I wanted to ask you before I introduce you how on earth you pronounce your last name. Perhaps you can, this has been a matter of some of great debate amongst my students and myself in the years that I've been teaching your texts and how to refer to you. So maybe Chrulew, is that right? Okay, I'll let you say it yourself. I think you're starting us off. Is that correct?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gary. Okay. I mentioned yesterday or the day before that in relation to Marius that it was the one time I was asked on like morning television in Australia to comment on the Marius situation, which was, you know, obviously a big public hot point at the time. And the producer asked how to pronounce my name. And so I sent them the phonetic spelling like I just did to you all in the chat. And then somehow I think work experience kid or whatever, it ended up being like the byline printed on the screen under my face was the phonetic spelling of my surname. So when I went back and my brother-in-law was sitting next to me watching it on the TV, had a very good laugh. So anyway, yes. Chrulew, which is some, you know, anglicized, bastardized version of what was a Russian surname, I believe. So thanks very much for having me. I wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded sovereign lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people of Western Australia, or Boorloo in Perth, to acknowledge elders past and present. I wanted to say hi to people that I haven't actually seen in person for maybe 10 or 15 years, like Carlo and Christina, who I met many years ago in Europe somewhere. Probably can't even remember which city it was. And it's great to meet everybody else. So this text that I sent through is from a really fascinating little volume. I imagine many of you will be familiar with the Henri Ellenberger essay on mental hospital and zoological garden. If you've been researching, it was Würzburg, I thought so, which has been reprinted a couple of times, this sort of pretty famous essay in this sort of history of zoos, written by a Swiss psychiatrist. Who ended up in Canada and did a lot of research on the sort of in phenomenological psychiatry and in ethnopsychiatry, and had this strange side interest in zoological gardens and this strange texts in which he compares zoos and mental hospitals, and sort of wants to think through what that comparison might mean, particularly from the side of alienist psychology, and basically what is it about, how can we think through the ways in which the problem is actually the keepers, the psychiatrists, and the effects that they have on their patients or the inmates and so on, which is a sort of, you know, a long-standing epistemological and therapeutic problem in medicine, in psychology, and indeed in zoo biology. But I've always found it strange that the texts that he uses for his some of his empirical stuff, he talks about Heidegger, who we met, but then he relies on this strange text by one Vera Heggie that isn't really much discussed elsewhere. And so I was very fascinated to learn when it was republished in 2014 in this beautiful little volume by La Bibliothèque, that in fact, he had co-authored this text with his wife, Emily Ellenberger, who was a Russian expat who had worked in the Moscow Zoo after the revolution in the 20s before emigrating to Europe. And so the postface to this book is written by their son, Michelle Ellenberger, that tells a little bit of this story about what went on. And it's sort of just such a fascinating text, and indeed such a well-written text that sort of wants to look behind the bars and look at the world behind the bars, you know, in terms of that Rilke poem, but the world not just of the animals, but of the animals and the keepers and the visitors, and, you know, the life of the zoo. That sort of we've been discussing in terms of thinking how do we talk about multi-species vibrancy and entanglement at the same time as recognizing, you know, the violence and captivity that's going on in these places. And this is just a really fascinating archival document in how those stories are told. This is part of a research project that I'm doing on zoo biology with Nigel Rothfels and Nellie Makivi from Tartu. And part of what we're focusing on is the question of the keeper-animal relationship and the way in which the keeper-animal relationship is often ignored or submerged in discourse, both within the zoo and outside it. And also looking at zoo biology as a source of scientific knowledge, as a source of new practices, as a source of technologies of power over animals that are often that have been exported and migrated outside the zoo to, you know, conservation biology and wildlife management, and also to human political institutions and apparatuses, you know, often throughout the 20th century, whether it's in architecture, whether it's in urban planning, whether it's in, you know, psychology of how offices work and how close we are told we should stay to people, which, you know, stems from Heidegger's ideas around flight distance and so on. And also thinking of, you know, about the significance of this as, you know, as the theme of Curry's workshop in the Anthropocene, where there is this generalized understanding that, you know, there's just a continuum of various forms of human-animal relationship, and so we ought to learn what we can about how best to negotiate them. And for all its flaws, the zoo is one place that where a lot of practice and thought has actually gone into how you do that. So what else did I want to say about this text? If you're interested in the Henri Ellenberger side of things and his thinking about captivity, pathology from the point of view of psychiatry, so you can read his essay. I recently published an essay in New Literary History called Abnormal Animals that goes into a bit of that question about the question of abnormality and the ways in which that concept of the abnormal within the zoo as a product of captivity, sort of the history of that concept and the way in which it actually became identified and problematized as an object of intervention and of knowledge within zoo biology, and in relation to within psychiatry. In terms of this text itself, I actually find it quite charming at times, quite sad and sorrowful at others. I might actually read you just a couple of pieces that weren't in the text that we sent. So in the postface written by their son Michelle recently. So there's actually an introduction to this book, Elizabeth de Fontenay, the philosopher, and in the postface by their son, he writes. So my mother never lost the melodious cadence of the Russian tongue, no matter what language she was speaking. She had a splendid disregard for grammatical rules, and her spelling was pure poetry. She did not write the captives of the zoo herself. She told the stories to my father, who wrote them down. This book is the joint work of a couple. The fervor and the dramatic tension animating each story are Emily Ellenberger's. Conciseness of the narrative and the formal elegance are Henri Ellenberger's. An attentive reader of this text should be able to identify the empathetic gaze of the former and the slightly ironic distance of the latter. And then fascinating anecdotes in there. Like, this book was published in 1944 under a German-speaking Swiss pseudonym. It is illustrated with a single drawing by Emily Ellenberger, a roaring tiger in its cage. If I do that, can you see it? With a few other rather disparate drawings. So she was an artist, and one of the things she did after they moved to Montreal was to continue with her art, which actually ended up being exhibited there. A few weeks after its publication, when the time came for press reports, two people calling themselves journalists made an appointment with my mother for a magazine story. They did not ask many questions about the book, but were very interested in the circumstances under which she had left Russia, the people who had helped her, etc. Needless to say, they were quickly shown the door, and the promised story never materialized. The Moscow Special Services were still active all through Europe. And so what I might do, I don't want to speak for too long because I want to give people a chance to talk about it, but I might just, there's a couple of more sort of archival, we managed to get hold of some of Henri's diaries where he talks about meeting Heidegger. So I just wanted to sort of establish that connection a little bit and the significance of Heidegger and that phenomenological tradition within zoo biology for Henri's work, and also for the, you know, this telling the stories of the life of the zoo and of the keeper-animal relations. So before leaving Zurich, I was anxious to see another old acquaintance, Dr. Heinrich Heidegger. One of the most remarkable men I knew. He has renewed the scope and methods of animal psychology by making of the zoo an observatory of animal behaviour and an institute of experimentation. Furthermore, Heidegger studied closely the pathological reactions of animals to captivity. These reactions are sometimes strikingly similar to certain regressive or catatonic attitudes of chronic patients in mental hospitals. These types of pathological behaviour do not appear in the circus animal, in contrast to the zoo animal, which Heidegger explained by the fact that the circus animal is compelled to work. Circus work thus appears to be the equivalent of occupational therapy. Many of the contributions of Professor Heidegger are illuminating from the point of view of psychiatry, etc. So that there was a personal involvement there, and the story goes that in every city that Henri and Emily would visit when he was giving his talks as a professional psychiatrist, they would go and visit both the zoological gardens and the mental hospitals. And the last I wanted to read, if I can just quickly find it, just the description. So you might know this, the Ellenberger essay is one of the ones that Derrida takes up in the Beast and the Sovereign lectures, when he's thinking through the question of historical thresholds in terms of zoos, and wanting to argue against that sort of Foucauldian and Agamben's notions of the changes in the sort of biopolitical structure of human-animal relations. So just to give you a sense of the range of the books, we only included two of the stories, a couple of summaries of a couple of other stories. So a tigress named Toby has been donated anonymously to the zoo under the condition that her former owner would be allowed an unsupervised visit later. She's rumoured to be a beautiful Oriental lady who had to give up her beloved tigress when she was expecting her first child. Heggie befriends her, the zookeeper Emily, but one day her former owner comes to visit. No one ever finds out what transpires during that time, but after the visit, Toby brutally and definitively rejects Heggie's friendship. And so this sort of interspecies jealousies and rivalries and attachments are a big part of like the storytelling. When we were talking yesterday about different fosterings between species that go on as a result of the detachments that captivity and zoos bring about, and these are also things that occur but within different human animal relationships, whether it's between keepers, carers, donors, original pet owners or otherwise. There's a lot of, as you would have seen from the introduction, it's as much a sort of the zoo as a mirror of, you know, the terrible people in the society, which is often a typical story. That's like the culmination of Heidegger's zoo book as well. It's about all the criminals and others who come to the zoo for their own nefarious purposes. So the bear who died of a broken heart, one of the many bears at the zoo, described in several vignettes, is known for his unsociability and has gone as far as to kill a female bear destined to be his companion. The zoo decides to get rid of him and to buy another bear on offer from the same group of people who sold this one. But when this group arrive at the zoo, the bear collapses dead. The subsequent autopsy reveals that his heart burst, which the veterinarians attribute to the shock of seeing his former owners again. A resentful moose, an irritable marmot, an unbearable donor who the only way they can get this annoying person out of the building is to sort of, dissect disgusting carcasses in front of them. And of course the story of the tigers who killed their keeper and how much that drew crowds and so on. So I might shut up now and let people tell me what their responses were to the text.
Thanks. The floor is open. I have maybe a question before we go any further. What made you pick these two particular excerpts to share with us?
Let me quickly remind myself which they were.
In particular, the bird lady, I guess, chapter. I was intrigued that you had selected that one in particular for.
Yeah. I just actually love the story. The character of the woman, like this is, if I was writing a short story, which I do sometimes, I would love to rip off her character with the little pamphlets she has quoting, ancient philosophers on bird language. Her, cat phobia, etc. I just thought that it was actually interesting bit of storytelling. And which was the other one that I sent in? It was the it was another of the big cats, wasn't it? If it was the big cat house, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the evocation of the angst of the animal. So there's a lot of different affective tones that she sort of draws from the different experiences that she's recollecting and telling the stories of, and obviously these aren't empirical anecdotes in that sense, that they are stories, they are narrated, and they're given these structures and so on, but they at least supposedly do come from her lived experience in the zoo, and her experience with the animals. And many of the stories are about, some of them are about her actually managing to achieve what one might call a friendship with one of the captive animals, or some form of attachment or affection. Some of the stories are about the impossibility of that, whether due to the nature of the institution, the architecture of the captivity, whether due to the life history of the animal, or whether due to just the nature of the species and its phylogeny. And other ones are particular life history stories, like the bear who, when it sees its former the people it had grown up with, again, is just so overwhelmed that it dies, or with the other one who, when it sees its former, owner, is reminded of the strength of that attachment to the point that it refuses the attachments that it had allowed itself in the zoo. So there's a lot of back and forth, but I just thought that the sort of the anguish of that cry of this lonely, alienated, isolated animal, and in thinking about this in terms of, I mean, there's so much argument in animal studies and so on around anthropomorphism and around the world of the animal, the unworlding and destruction of the life worlds of the animal, and the poverty of their worlds, etc., etc. And I thought it was a text that actually managed to give some voice and shape to that destroyed and yet nonetheless still felt world of the big cat. I notice we've got a couple of hands. I'm not sure whether Andrew or Carla was first. Go, Andrew.
Yeah, I think it's Andrew first. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. I'm so happy you brought this all to our attention. I'm struck similarly by the beauty of the writing, the beauty of the storytelling. I'm struck by sort of the control over the prose. So I have a question about that. Like, I'm sorry if you missed. I feel like I was listening too hard to what you were saying, and I may have missed some of the basics. But was Heggie also a writer?
So what Michelle says, so Henri was a writer in the sense of a academic scientific writer, as a psychiatrist. Emily was not, and so it's Henri who wrote down her stories that she told him, is what their son Michelle says in the postface. Yeah. So, but yeah, they are. I mean, they are. No, actually, no, that's not correct, because it was published in French. But no, she did write. I apologize. She did write, but I think she wrote in German.
Okay.
Because she also published children's book about the circus, and published some other naturalistic popular texts as well. So yeah, I think it was written in French by Henri from stories that she told.
Okay. I was wondering also, maybe a larger question, and just put however many limits on this as you want when you answer, but I'm really struck by that part in the big cat house. These people who would have been seized by a terrible panic if they had encountered even one of these animals in the wild, delighted in seeing them helpless, humiliated, and degraded. And I was wondering, because I'm struggling to get my head around Heidegger and how to write about Heidegger, how does this compare to Heidegger's overall tone toward the zoo? Like, if you could explain that to me as someone who is still, I feel, scratching the surface on his work. Is that a similar sentiment to how Heidegger would kind of express how he feels about a zoo as well? Is that too simple a way to put it? I don't know.
Can you just read that passage again, just so I can find it?
Yeah, it's 196 on the reader. So all day long, the graph starts, all day long, a vast crush of bothersome and raucous visitors would parade along the cages. These people who would have been seized by a terrible panic if they'd encountered even one of these animals in the wild, delighted in seeing them helpless, humiliated, and degraded. I was struck by that sentence.
Yeah. So I don't think that, to me, that's not Emily Ellenberger's, that's her position on those people, less so than the zoo itself, I think. And I think that was part of the tone you get from people like Heidegger, and I think in this text, is this sort of disdain for the riffraff that come in and they're the ones that are humiliating and degrading the animals rather than the captivity itself. And so they would contrast that sort of behavior of, feeding them the wrong food, throwing things at them, sticking pins in their fur, and all the other things they did. And Heidegger would similar,
Okay.
from a more enlightened, scientific, and also caring building of a relationship with the animal. So yeah, I wouldn't characterize that, I don't think, as either the Ellenberger's or Heidegger's position on captivity.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. More a disdain for the uncivilized and uncouth visitors, and they're the ones who degrade the animal.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I see that. Okay.
It's closer to Randy Malamud's position, I think, on the zoo
Right.
goer.
Yeah, right. So, but Randy thinks that there's nothing salvageable, and there is only that domination and humiliation and alienation. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, I was wondering what you make of the anthropomorphism of this kind of narratives. Since you're the Heidegger expert, and anthropomorphism is the bête noire of Heidegger. His criticism to traditional zoo is the traditional way of seeing animals, is anthropomorphism. But these kind of narratives, especially in a project about the relationship between keepers and animals, what do you make of it? What this inherent anthropomorphism?
Let me just give me a second. And I'll tell you first what Elizabeth de Fontenay wrote, that enormous philosophical history of the silence of animals in philosophy, says in her introduction. What makes their joint work so intriguingly accurate and this book so charming is the crucial and pathetic claim that there is an analogy between ailments created by captivity, those of animals and those of the mentally ill. One could take Vera Heggie to task for her overly anthropomorphic perception of the animals under her care during entire time in which she experienced the social relegation and loneliness caused by her bourgeois origins. Doing so would mean dismissing the fact that the knowledge of carers can sometimes be greater than that of scientists, and above all, that projecting emotions onto animals demonstrates a generosity that allows us to go further in communicating with some of them and discovering what they are capable of. Anthropomorphism as a method is an ascesis that deflects the ferocious anthropocentrism unthinkingly adopted by Western man, this vain owner exploiting as he pleases all those he deems different. In this regard, Vera Heggie is absolutely ruthless when it comes to the stupid and sometimes cruel crowd of zoo-goers and some of her colleagues. So I think Fontenay's on the mark in some senses. The question of anthropomorphism in Heidegger is a really interesting one. On the one hand, he was absolutely ruthless in excluding anthropomorphism from scientific experiments and the vision of animals, but that is based on not the traditional exclusion of anthropomorphism, that due to the dualistic divide between humans and animals, and one should simply just not project human characteristics onto the muteness of nature, but rather on a thoroughly zoocentric, comparative animal psychology in which animals and humans share many traits, right? So you can only critique anthropomorphism if you're able to actually say what are the appropriate characteristics of humans that differ from the appropriate characteristics of animals. Heidegger thought, yeah, the anthropomorphism is going on all the time in some bad scientists, but more often he also had a problem with mechanomorphism and the projection of machine-like qualities onto animals, when in fact, they're living, they're affective, they're subjects, they have a world that they produce, they build relationships with people around them, and so on. So it's sort of like it's really important for German, Swiss, Dutch animal psychologists in the early and mid 20th century to be really strict about this as a scientific stance, because of obviously the debacles of the over-anthropomorphism of late 19th and early 20th century animal psychology, with all the talking horses and counting horses and clever Hans and all of this. So that they are, and this is what ethology was reacting to, and obviously then we get behaviorism, etc. And so they really are needing to be able to say, no, we're scientific, we're not inappropriately, we're not going to get sucked in like all of those performers and charlatans and so on. But at the same time, Heidegger, I think, was extremely willing to allow to animals all the traits that he thought they in fact possessed, and those were many more than most scientists would actually allow, if that makes sense. And I think Omri and Emily Ellenberger sort of agreed with him. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't mean it in a critical way, but I mean, as a critic of anthropomorphism, on the contrary, I'm working, that's my project on empathy anthropomorphism. So yeah. I was more sympathetic to, I didn't know the Fontenay introduction, that's a very good text for me, but more against Heidegger, against anthropomorphism, because that's he himself, I mean, he makes use of the positive aspects of anthropomorphism. That was only my point. I mean,
yeah. And so he was actually really involved in and interested in those debates. So he went to New York for the big the scientific discussion around the talking apes that they had, that Thomas Sebeok and others organized, and Sebeok got Heidegger to write the first text of that volume on the clever Hans phenomenon that connected it to the whole talking apes thing. And this, for Heidegger, he at first thought that all these American ape language experiments were just a repetition of the turn of the century German, counting and talking dogs and horses. But he just sort of changed his opinion, because he actually went and did some research and met the researchers and the animals a little bit. But so yeah, he actually was quite involved in that discussion around the clever hands effect, and so you're sort of in the 70s in the States as well. Yeah, and I mean, so, and when Fontenay, that Fontenay paragraph that I read out on anthropomorphism, her language is drawing, I think, very much on Vincent Desprez's work, and the arguments about how, in fact, a good experiment is one that gives the animals a chance to show us what they can do, and that involves building a relationship rather than eliminating a relationship. Yeah,
I guess this is the essence of the disdain for the bird lady, because she takes the parrot's ability to repeat these same phrases mechanically as evidence of its intelligence, whereas they say, no, this is the stupidest thing you could ask a parrot to do.
Yes, it's the negative
yeah.
side.
Yeah. So we've got 4 hands.
Yeah.
Oh.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. It was really striking, and I was especially intrigued by the bird lady, as I think many of us were. But and I was sort of wondering, because sort of reading through it, it almost seems as if you're entering sort of a different world, because sort of in a way, it also sort of, I think somewhere near the beginning, there's also almost like a different taxonomy being described sort of the house was filled with birds of every species, every age and every size, living in proximity to the mistress of the house that was dependent on the degree of love she bore to them. So there's also sort of this weird different taxonomy in a sense, and also later on sort of they talk about sort of how the parrot was sort of a living illustration of her theories. And I was sort of wondering whether I feel like this is sort of an interspecies relation that also allows for, I don't know whether they're correct sort of different epistemologies, but I was sort of wondering whether in other stories this also occurs, like sort of almost this creation of a different world in which human and animal exist together, and whether or not that's productive or not. But I was curious about that.
It is. It's interesting that if you were to describe that as a taxonomy of relationships or entanglements, then it's one based on the strength of attachments. And like, so partly how this text, how I conceive this text is it's sort of a meditation on, you know, on that question of the necessity and impossibility almost simultaneously of these intimate human-animal relationships, and a little bit of, you know, like a moral pageant of the ways in which they go wrong, or the barriers that there are to them and so on. Obviously, there's a disdainful attitude to this sort of, the bird lady's maybe, what is she, like a hoarder figure or some sort of crazy bird lady, who has let the attachments get away from her, instead of developing him in you know, a flourishing relationship. And then there's other examples of people who approach that attachment in the wrong way, and it's always from the point of view of this sort of this figure who has unprecedented access, that the people that she's sort of commenting on don't actually have, which sort of, you know, just example sort of multiplies the ironies of it as well. So I mean, that's not much of an answer, but just sort of a continued riff on sort of on that theme, which, yeah, it does absolutely throughout the book. There's a variety of different examples of they're not hierarchies, but sort of, yeah, various forms, extreme and unhealthy forms in which the human-animal attachment can take in captivity. Yeah,
because I was also sort of struck by the at times very moralistic sort of tone of the story, also in sort of the viewers of the animals, but also sort of in the correct kind of relations, which is, it was very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I think Gail was next.
Hi, Matthew. I was really excited that you put this text forward because, you know, having read the Ellenberger, it's kind of nice to have a chance to read the text, because it's not translated into English, I don't believe. So it was great that you put that forward, and I think it's interesting to think about that hierarchy of voices. You know, with, I guess, you know, Derrida being a source of people being interested in the Ellenberger article, and then, you know, folding down to discovering the voice, and then you talking about what the Sun said. You know, it's like, it's kind of an interesting further twist on the text, which I didn't realize that, you know, it was a kind of joint project. So I think that is kind of a really interesting thing to bring forward in terms of that voice of direct experience as well, you know, like how that kind of comes forward. And I think that links to the keeper, or the interest in the keeper kind of relationship too. And I've been kind of trawling through newspaper articles looking for, in the post-war period, looking for keeper relationship articles. And so there's also quite a lot of kind of disturbing material in terms of that. One of the most striking ones I came across was this photo of, you know, an unhappy elephant keeper. I think it was in one of the big North American zoos. I can't remember whether it's the Bronx and so it's like in about the 1960s, and he's sitting in front of his elephant house and he's not allowed in. the directors told him, over my dead body, you're never going back in there. And he's basically lost his temper and beaten the elephant. And it's just like they're reporting on a domestic violence scene. So it's kind of interesting. And to play back to that bird lady kind of question that Powell was raising, like in the kind of psychology literature, over-identification with animals is often taken as a sign of, you know, mental disturbance. And you know, a kind of Heidegger hints at some of those things as well, I think, in his text. So I just wondered whether you wanted to say anything on that, because I think, and the other thing is, I guess, the work I'm doing, looking at the idea of the intersection between art brutalism and the post-war zoo. So much of what I've been looking at converges on Swiss mental hospitals. It's actually really kind of interesting. The Dubuffet visited Swiss mental hospitals. Le Corbusier, the architect, I only recently found out his cousin was in a Swiss mental hospital, and he actually did all these overdrawings on his, he actually got a lot of ideas from his cousin who was in the Swiss mental hospital. And, you know, it was like these kinds of, and Ibn Abi Warburg, who was mentioned the other day, was also in similar Swiss mental hospitals. And then Ellenberger actually writes these really fascinating histories of because the Swiss psychology and psychiatry was just so important at that time, you know, and so it's a kind of, it's really quite intense. And I was sort of thinking about Heidegger's relationship to that main body of psychiatry and psychology. And I know Christina had told me too about Heidegger being really interested in Walter Corti, who I know pretty much nothing about because I found one article, but it's, and he's kind of interested in some of these questions as well. But so I was just to ask you about that kind of identification, you know, over-identification with animals.
Yeah. Oh man, I could go on for hours. Like the archive is just full of these stories about the misunderstandings, misidentifications, over-identifications, etc., botched attachments, etc., that you know, like when Heidegger, I think he's interviewed in one of the major American magazines at some point in the 50s or 60s, when after his books are translated and taken up by all the American zoo bosses. And the story leads with a story about, you know, some bird, you know, wanting to have sex with him, and that, you know, these are really common stories as well, and it's a source of humor in the story. So that's another important part of that history as well. Obviously, you know, given the fact that what modern biological zoobology, its main task was to work out ways in which to get the animals to breed into captivity and to take over their reproductive, you know, to find a way to anthropogenically manage and institutionalize their sexual reproduction. As for the, I mean, there's an enormous history of Ellenberger's involvement in discovery of the unconscious and all of that material. I think a part of the interesting, I think some more work needs to be done on Monica Meyer-Holzapfel, who was, I think, Heidegger's student and colleague in Switzerland and replaced him after he left Basel, I think. And that all her work was in that, a lot of her work was in the area of abnormal animal behaviors in zoos. And it was really Heidegger and Meyer-Holzapfel who sort of identified that, you know, that abnormality, whether it's in the pacing up and down the cages or the stereopathies or all these other behaviors, as actually responses to captivity, and therefore as things that they could intervene in removing the effects of their own production of the environment in order to make the environment one in which, you know, more accurately transposed, or at least didn't produce these abnormalities and so on. So there's an interesting history to be told there as well. but I better not go on because I think we may already even be over time.
Just a little bit, but it's okay.
Yeah.
There are two more hands, and then we can.
Okay, great. I think Mariana.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, from what you just said, I wonder like if this captivity is also the fact, like, you know, attracting the abnormal humans in a way, like the way that this text suggests, something along the lines what Ralph Acampora is suggesting with, you know, his porno, how's it called again? Porno vision, porno.
Yeah.
Duo something. I forgot now. Yeah, so there's also this interesting way in which captivity might work two ways, or at least how it was seen at a certain time point. But I actually wanted to ask or talk about that I thought originally that you selected these two different excerpts to kind of juxtapose them a little bit, because there's this, you know, a little bit of inconsistency, the way that the big cat house and its inhabitants are described, and like, you know, of course there's anthropomorphism, but there's a specific kind of anthropomorphisms, like you know, the regal family of the felines, and the felines, some of them respecting the authority of the director, and, you know, all of these things. And then kind of making fun of the bird lady, although like these two positions are in some ways similar. I wondered like if this text could be read as kind of a mechanism of making of expert knowledge at that time in a post-war period, for like expert knowledge in care, and in this way that Western epistemology still functions in this way, that you have to have an anti-example, you have to ridicule some ways of relating to animals to elevate your ways to relating to animals. So like, the bird lady is kind of maybe necessary in the whole memoir and the story to kind of differentiate, like, well, this is legitimate knowledge of caring for animals, and this one is not. And also the difference that is between those relationships and their description is in labor relation, that like the zookeepers are employed to care for animals, whereas for the bird lady, she's like something from the past, right? She's this odd person, and she's a hoarder, she's a collector, she has this pseudoscientific, like literally making science needs pseudoscience. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah,
I want to really think about it.
100%. That so that's sort of what I was getting at a bit before, in terms of the attitude of people like Heidegger and others to the visitors, and so on. So I'll just quickly read one paragraph from the concluding chapter of his Wild Animals in Captivity, in which precisely makes the point you were saying. So in all ages and places, menageries and zoos have attracted not only men with a healthy interest, but all kinds of abnormal ones upon whom the zoo seems to act like a magnet. And then he goes on to actually classify them: petty criminals, thieves, psychopathics, weak-minded and idiots, murderers and suicides, right? And so there's absolutely that side in which the scientific expert is wanting to distinguish themselves as the expert, and that's part of my argument, is that's precisely what Heidegger's doing in modernizing the zoo as a biopolitical institution, is setting up the role of knowledge. I think the Heggie text has an interesting place in relation to that, because it's not explicitly zoo expertise, and because there's also often a status disjunction between the director, for example, and the keepers. The keepers themselves are the ones who perform the attachment relationships and care, and they will overinvest and so on. And then Heidegger will tell them off for, you know, not taking a properly scientific and biological approach to the keeping. But his role is nonetheless to help bring them up to his level, to remove all the things that might cause a threat to the health and well-being of the animal, and to get everything on a properly professional scientific expert pathway. So yeah, I think you're totally right.
And there's something perverse almost about the bird lady, right? Like, isn't there like a tension also in the way that like there's certain kinds of proximity and distance in those relationships, in which some are okay and some are just not appropriate. And this perversion is of like a little bit of a sexual kind, I wonder. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but
no, just like, yeah.
I mean, it's not those sorts of descriptions aren't that different to the descriptions you get in contemporary zoo text. There's one, I think, that even came out of Taronga from probably 20, 30 years ago. And it's like, yeah, the bird guy. And he lives there and sleeps there. They shit all over him. And he's just, they can't go home because they constantly have to be there because he's the one that they've imprinted on, and he's the only one who can actually care for them. So there's absolutely, yeah, there's probably a mini genre of bird people in zoo history.
But I think there's a difference between the bird guy, I mean, Konrad Lorenz and whatever, the kind of the bird papa.
Oh yeah,
and the kind of the crazy bird lady, right? I mean,
exactly. And I think
they have a different kind of
this is what people were
talking
about over the last couple of days as well. Yeah, and Lorenz, he's the bird mother, and he does it even better than you know any woman would. Yeah. I think Christina, I think you were the next.
Yes, thank you very much for this text. So I didn't know it, and yeah, I'm very much interested in the link between zoo and psychology and hospital. I think the connection between Heidegger and Humphrey Osmond, who did a planning for a hospital, for a mental hospital in Canada, is something very important. So they read Animals in Captivity and tried to implement Heidegger's time and space concept, and especially the concept of shelter on the inhabitants of this mental hospital. So that was one idea as well. And yes, and I was wondering if there are more links between psychiatry and not only this Ellenberger text. I think this is the first time I read it, so I have to think longer about it. But as Mariana said, and many mentioned before, so the Heidegger, I think Heidegger didn't really like his audience because he considered them as psychopaths. So you read out this things,
yeah.
Wild Animals in Captivity. And it leads to a kind of a concept of the zoo as a space for social hygiene, to get this missing link to nature, and then people go into this scientific zoo, which is the concept of Heidegger's zoo, and then they can get this link to nature somehow back, and then they have a mental cure, they're cured somehow by the zoo. So this is a bit short taken, but maybe it is this kind of direction. And the link to Walter Corti, which Gail mentioned, is that Heidegger was a Catholic, and so he is very distant when he describes everything, but he always argues with Konrad Lorenz that the animal is an individual and not only a species. And he doesn't really say that the animal has a soul, but so that would be true anthropomorphizing. But with his Catholic background, I think it's important to see the animal or the psyche of an animal. So
yeah,
and yeah, maybe you read something more about in this direction, also with this thing about the soul and the link to something metaphysical in this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because he has these strange limit points at which he won't let himself go past in terms of his argumentation, especially when he lets himself go beyond the sort of scientific, what's proper and appropriate in scientific literature, and he gets more autobiographical and more philosophical in his writings in the 80s. So yeah, one of the other things that I've managed to do is Anna Katerina has translated his book Understanding Animals, which will be coming out next year. And he has, yeah, you can, he at points he is just unwilling to break down the human-animal divide in the way that you might expect because of a theological commitment to the distinctiveness of the human soul. At the same time, he is wanting to push as far as possible the understanding of animals as subjects and so on. So there's still a lot to be explored there. He was actually drawing on, is it Peterson? No, what's his name? There's a German ontologist, sort of. Hartmann, sorry, Nikolai Hartmann. So he liked Hartmann's ontological stratification of the levels of nature. And so he felt that he was able to work in that frame. So you've got, yeah, anyway, it allowed him to both maintain the distinctness of the human soul in that fit with his religious beliefs, and to explore the breadth of animal psychology and all of the features in the world. But just the last note I wanted to make on the question of the links with the sort of extra zoological technologies of knowledge and power, whether in psychiatry or in architecture and urban planning and all these things. Yeah, I think one of the other pathways is Edward Hall and proxemics. The sort of the hidden dimension and those sorts of arguments, which took on Heidegger's studies of flight distance and so on, to look at, there was sort of basically this quasi-moral panic about urbanization and all the problems that we have, and the very racially coded problems about urban problems of crime and so on. And you've got these nice white experts who want to come in and tell people the proper spacings and how we ought to live and how we ought to set up a city so that we can eliminate all these social hygiene problems. And they often do take these sort of biological arguments out of zoobiology or ethology, at the sort of basis of their psychology. But I think we've probably gone over time.
I think we may have to leave it at that. I mean, yeah. We can just add another day onto the workshop. I think that would probably be a good idea. Anyway, but just in the interests of giving Andrew also enough time to present his work, I suggest we move on here. But as I say, since we don't have a keynote speaker waiting in the wings here, I don't mind if we eat into the final discussion a little bit. Anyway, thank you for bringing this text to our attention and for allowing us to read an excerpt of the as yet unpublished translation. Do you have an expectation of when this? You said you were trying to get it published.
Yeah, I hope next year.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Andrew, you're up.
Hi. Okay. I feel like we should take a couple of minutes to let that land. I still have a million questions for Matthew, but maybe I'll email them to you. All right. So I guess I'll just introduce what I'm trying to do. For those of you who don't know, I'm a journalist and a novelist, and I teach creative writing at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And so I'm not a scholar per se. I usually preface everything I do with that sentence. And I'm writing a trade nonfiction book aimed at a lay audience that's attempting to ask some of the big questions that I think regular folk have about the modern zoo, increasingly that the millennial generation has about the modern zoo, and each sort of generation that pops up, it seems the stats show that there's increased skepticism and more questions to be asked. So I've always had, as it sounds like everyone here does, a deeply conflicted relationship with the institution. And as a journalist, I wanted to start picking away at that and get at that. And so So that's what I'm doing. And the chapter draft that I shared with you, it's kind of a nice way, I guess, to end off. I feel honored to be the last speaker here, but I was actually, when I came to workshop number 2 in Utrecht and met many of you guys in person, which was delightful, I was actually on my way through to Hamburg to begin the research, to do the visit, to build this chapter out. And many of you guys gave me so many amazing thoughts to take away with me, especially about Rothfells and all of that, as you can see. So, but I also thought, because I asked you to read my own work, and I'm sure there's some of you that just couldn't get around to it. What I thought I would do is just quickly take you on a bit of a slideshow through just my experience at Hagenbeck, just to set the scene for the chapter that I've given you. What I would love from you guys is to you can treat this slideshow as much as the subject of this, as much as my writing. And if you want to get into the nitty-gritty if you want to workshop my work, I have a very thick skin, but if it is more just generative for conversation, I'm super happy with that. So I thought I would just really quickly, 10 minutes, take you guys through, just with my terrible photography on my phone. Can you guys see that now? Okay, so I'll just whip you through really quickly. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure some of you guys, many of you maybe have been to Hagenbeck, and I don't know how much to preface him and the place, so I just won't. This is the Orangutan House, the Globe Theater, as they say, in Hamburg. And it opens in the summer months so that there's a view kind of stretching to the horizon for those orangutans who are up in the top of the climbing structures. This is the inside. This is the set. This is the stage. I was shocked when Tjark, the keeper, actually referred to the downstairs, the underneath, as backstage. There's a degree to which the metaphor of the theater has kind of so baked itself into Hagenbeck and the mystique around it, that even the people who work there, without a tongue in their cheek, kind of still refer to it this way. And I that was one of the things that left me a bit mind boggled after visiting. Among the other things was the delight that I sensed from the PR person who sort of escorted me in, didn't escort me all over the place, but escorted me in and knew that I was a journalist, and knew kind of I have some real misgivings, and I'm really, curious about this place, and still was just really delighted that I was here to write about this great, it felt like this great man. And so, yeah, my head was spinning for the entire 4 days I was here. So this is Bella, and because I have a background in a tiny background in primatology, Bella was, of course, a big draw for me. Bella's now officially in the Guinness Book of World Records as of earlier this year as being the oldest orangutan in captivity. I believe the oldest lived orangutan ever recorded. Bella, as if you did read the piece, you'll know that Bella was this kind of super mother figure who, to the keepers at least, who just continued to adopt these young orangutans in as much as she could in this kind of faux forest setting. And so there was a part of me that was really driven just to write about Bella, but at Hagenbeck one can't just do that. Because of this legacy, this is inside the archive. It's actually a really tiny room where Klaus Gille sort of operates. This is the image to which he refers to as the happy family. This isn't actually Hagenbeck, but this is Hagenbeck did a lot of work around circus training, and so this is very prominent in the archive. Potentially a book cover, yeah, who knows? I'm I'm open to any and all suggestions. There may be more pictures. I think I actually know what I want my book cover to be, and it's later on. Yeah, this is right next to the image in the archive. Again, I was perplexed by everyone's willingness to let me just take photos of the archive as well, because it just dripped in irony. There down in the left is the bust of Hagenbeck staring out at us, and this gigantic tusk kind of ornamenting the pillars. Amazing, Gail. There he is up on the, not a mantle, but top of the bookcase there. So this is that famous image of this zoological paradise, the sort of the garden that Hagenbeck is famous for inventing, taking on the road, and then basically constructing at Hagenbeck Zoo in Stellingen. So this is the original, one of the original kind of drawings. I became obsessed with this little family down in the bottom right corner. And this is, I mean, you could talk for hours just simply about this image. I'm sure many of you already could and have. And here we have, this is just one of the images that has appeared all over the place, but this is one of the original, I don't know if it's the original print, but of this shot from early when Hagenbeck was opened of the Africa panorama. So this is the famous landscape architecture, the naturalistic enclosure that Hagenbeck, of course, is known for. For those of you who aren't aware, Hagenbeck is considered to be that kind of founder of that naturalistic look, even though there's ways to complicate the moniker founder. But his whole concept of creating this place where one could go and see animals walking without seeing the bars, without seeing the cages, seeing almost like an entire panoramic landscape of a certain biogeographic region, but by the sneaky use of vegetation, of hidden walls, of moats, of boulders, and these gigantic mountains that were fabricated. This is it today, or a couple of years ago, I guess, right after I met some of you guys, with the flamingos in the foreground, and then just underneath the mountains there, you can see the lion den. They were actually roaring as I was taking these photos. Klaus Gilla, the archivist, sort of took me around, and this is the scene. This really is the spot, the place where mostly German zoogoers could come and see this kind of imagination, this imagining of an entire panoramic biogeographic region all in one shot. And there's many others at the zoo. There's the polar region, which was bombed in the war and rebuilt just recently. So to walk through this park is to walk through a zoo, but something with multiple things layered over top of it. It's just, so many writers have spent books dealing with it. I won't bother trying to do that here. This I thought was interesting. This is just looking down from the top of the mountains, because you can actually climb up into the mountains and look out and see back down. And here you can actually see more of the barriers, which I thought was kind of interesting. I wondered how many of the barriers the animals could actually see when in fact the humans couldn't. So the other photo before that was taken just way down there near the horizon, near those tents. So as we were walking, this is, Klaus was sort of explaining to me that this is still one of the only zoos where you can feed the elephants during regular feeding times yourself, which again, I was really, really struck by, and was sort of given no sort of further comment on, except to say that it's a shame that this isn't the way it still works. And then Hagenbeck, of course, also, I mean, amongst the head-spinning things he did with his money was mount several expeditions into the continent of Africa to attempt to find, dinosaurs. And so he actually had built this rather remarkable series that I have a whole series of photos, but I didn't include them, of dinosaur statues, which are actually right beside the orangutan bubble. And then, of course, we've got this overlay of this obsession with cultures other than his. This was a gift, I believe this is the Thai temple. It was a gift from a high-level Thai official to Hagenbeck, having to do with Hagenbeck's, of course, deep relationships built through his animal trading empire. And then this is that image that kind of stops me in the piece that I wrote, but truly did stop me in my tracks. It's right also next to the orangutan place. I sort of spotted it as we were looking at the Thai temple and as I was heading back to see Bella. And this is again one of the old sets, of course, for this this element of zoo history that as a lay writer and as a journalist, I am struggling immensely with how to grapple with, and I'm wondering if there's ways for you guys to help me or give some thoughts toward how to introduce and deal with the human zoo, the people shows, the ethnographic displays, whatever you want to call them. That part of the history of zoos where from a craft perspective, I don't want that to be, I actually don't need that to be the take home of this particular chapter, because this chapter is really obsessed with architecture and these enclosures and what the point of these enclosures is. But of course, it all comes from, as Rothfels points out, it comes from all of this thinking and investment behind these people shows that Hagenbeck was also running, importing people from cultures, indigenous cultures around the world, and putting on these shows for the German public. So this is one of the leftover kind of remains of one of the sets for people from Myanmar who came over, who were shipped over and played a role in these people shows. So I don't think this book can or should spend too long on that subject, but I am so aware of how gigantic it is and central it is and important. And so I'm grappling a little bit with that, and I'm certainly grappling in this draft that you've read with that issue. And then, of course, I also had my head sent spinning by the offer from Tjark to actually go inside. And I'll tell you, I stood at this door for a long time. I felt, I still regret going inside to some degree. I regret having invaded this world. I know why I did. I know the part of me that desperately wanted to, and I gave into it. And I'm hoping to use the experience as positively as I can, but I did go inside. I witnessed their world from something like their perspective. This is the view out from almost where Bella would spend many of her days, near one of the babbling creeks, where the water would come out, where she would hang out for a lot of the day. So this is very much Bella's view for much the rest of her life, I'm presuming. And then I've also got, so there's another image from inside. And then I also have a video. I don't know if it's gonna, let's see. I'll just play this. Can you just thumbs up if that's working for you? Okay, great. Yeah, this is just a 360 of kind of from not far from where Bella is sitting. And it's okay, I didn't want the sound because I think I'm trying to narrate it like it's just a terrible narration. So there's a big ladder that goes up behind that tree. This was one of those serendipitous timing things that happened as a visiting journalist that I didn't say no to. And right there is where you can see where Bella would usually hang out. Yeah, so it just seemed, yeah, thematically, we're talking about the theater, the stage, the Edison quote about the animals being out of a cage and on a stage, and it just seemed it was. I'll admit to it being just simply too enticing to not go in and break that fourth wall for myself and see what it was like from the other side. So that's about it. That's how I felt about this whole experience. This is actually weirdly the Museum of Illusions in Hamburg, a place I went, a place I'm still, this is the book cover, yeah. This, it's in Hamburg. I know other cities have museums of illusions, but I'd never heard of it. And I went to it and I just couldn't get over the fact that I was just leaving this zoological park of illusion to go to the Museum of Illusion. My editor, every time I tell her that, she just rolls her eyes. I just know she's getting out her scalpel to cut that. But there's something I want to do with that eventually. But this is the experience sent me on a bit of a loop, and I'm still unpacking it a bit. And then this is another image that we could probably stay on and talk about for a long time. This is one of the shoes that I wore into Bella's enclosure. I stayed in the Hagenbeck Hotel, which is right next door, and which is unbelievably kitschy. Every time you get out of the elevator, every elevator has a different kind of faux geographically accurate kind of musical background. So I was staying on the African continent floor. So all these like drums would play the second you'd walk out of the elevator. And all the artwork was just this faux indigenous stuff. It was just all made of plastic. And it was such an awkward hotel, but I'm so glad I went because it speaks volumes. But the problem was I didn't know until I got into my hotel room and smelled something that I actually tracked orangutan poo from the enclosure in the zoo all the way through the lobby of the hotel into the elevator, along the carpets in my hallway and into my room. And I just had the sense that this was one of the most authentic things that had ever happened in this hotel. And so we can ignore this photo or spend the entire day on it. Yeah, I felt terrible, but this is my shoe drying on the towel rack. So I just, thought that would start us off. So I'm happy to open the floor to any conversation, any questions. I'm really curious to hear from you guys.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm glad that we get to have you finishing off the. I think you went last at the second workshop as well. So there's a certain kind of continuity to this.
Did I do I feel like I did a writing prompt last time. Did we start writing? I can't remember.
I can't remember.
No, maybe we didn't.
Anyway,
okay.
I'm going to stop talking. There are lots of hands.
Carlo.
Yeah, I'm very curious about your pleasure or perverse pleasure in all this experience. I mean, you come out very critical to this staging, or to this theater, or to this Disneyland for things, but there is a pleasure in it. There is you're enjoying it, and you're happy you did it and you're doing it. And this seems to me to be your problem with what you're going to write.
Yeah. I think you're 100% correct.
Well, because I don't share it. That's my point. I'm curious about it because I have a very different relationship to zoos and this kind of experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure I would call it pleasure, but it's definitely curiosity. I want to know, like in terms of going into that enclosure, I definitely wanted to know. It wasn't about. It was a deeply somber experience. It wasn't that I was enjoying myself. but I wanted to be able to write about that perspective and without imagining myself into it. I might have tried to do that if I hadn't gone in there. But you make a good point, and I think most of the people who might eventually read this probably do have that experience at a zoo. They're conflicted, but that takes aside, sort of sits in the back seat for their pleasure to take over. But
yeah, zoos are still, I mean, they still make a lot of money because of that, huh? Because people enjoy them. Huh? There is a jouissance, huh, in this kind of experience.
Yeah, and I think writing from that perspective might be actually useful as a way of backloading some of these larger questions I want to ask. I don't think a book that's just, I mean, we talked about Malamud earlier. I don't think a book that is just openly, deeply, profoundly critical and closed off to this thing that 700 billion people go to a year or whatever it is, 700 million. I don't think that would be helpful. I don't think that's going to accomplish what I think I want to try to accomplish, which is start more people having these critical thoughts and considerations of the enterprise. Gail?
Yeah, I agree that that's a very tricky task that you've set yourself. And my question is probably going to be not very helpful to you in a sense, because I'm responding more to the kind of position Hagenbeck occupies in zoo studies generally. And I'm relatively new to zoo studies myself, but I do know I have got a professional background in architecture and the study of the picturesque, and it always strikes me that Hagenbeck's originality is very overstated. If you put it in the tradition of the picturesque and the ha-ha and the kind of the Parc des Buttes Chaumont in Paris, which was quite revolutionary. A lot of Hagenbeck's technologies are borrowed, like they're not new. I mean, so I think that there's something absolutely, I mean, he deserves his central place, but I'm not quite convinced that he's not an impasse in zoo studies or something like that, because I think, and even reading your book, reading your chapter made this quite clear to me, how important I think his role is as a kind of biopolitical regime that he invents. And this is kind of, plays to you and what Matthew was talking about, but that whole kind of comprehensive shift in the treatment of animals that he brings about, I think is really more interesting to me anyway than his kind of architectural achievement of the scenic stage. And so if you put his zoo kind of design in the broader context of picturesque design, then it kind of becomes less kind of, I guess, dramatic. I mean, it's still an amazing zoo, don't get me wrong, but and then if you also put it in the context of the kind of visual machine that, the spectatorship and the Colosseums and the cycloramas and all of the kind of visual machines that were very much part of that kind of 19th century viewing experience. So I think sometimes his isolation in the kind of zoo history kind of doesn't quite make all those other connections. And the reason it concerns me, I suppose, isn't because, I want the history to be perfect, but because Hagenbeck's so important in that return to the natural kind of zoo. And there's a real failure to connect to the colonial kind of history at that point in the return to the natural zoo in the 1980s. And so that to me, at least partly explains why we have a proliferation of African huts and really unreconstructed kind of, zoo paraphernalia, like the new, I know Christina's looked at the Lua Savannah, which has like little replica planes and airports, and it's got Brismex plane, I think, in the zebra kind of thing. Like there's all this, you know, paraphernalia of, which maybe needs to be thought through a little bit more by the zoos. But I kind of just am interested in that. How can Hagenbeck be, how can we shift him from that kind of rock that he occupies in the center of zoo studies? So that's probably enough question for me.
That's really interesting, Gail. I've certainly read much deeper than simply the Rothfells or the, oh, his name's escaping me, the big large format book, but
Ames.
and I've, yeah, thank you. And I've been struggling myself with how many areas of this story he actually does touch and is sort of foundational in. As I go and as I've been going, every time I've tried to describe some of the absurd panoramas or enclosures that I've seen at other zoos, his work keeps coming back. And so I have a feeling that across the course of my entire book, I think there's going to be a much more three-dimensional portrait of this man painted through considering him in various places. I can't get away from him in a way. And so I'm really keen to start complicating my understanding of him. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Hey, Andrew, nice to see you again and to read your work.
You too.
I enjoyed reading this draft, and I have a lot of different thoughts. But one is sort of, one is a really small one on page 3. Well, actually, I'll start with the bigger thing. I think what was most interesting to me about reading this is how the staff at the zoo today are trying to sort of reimagine or the history of Hagenbeck and this exact zoo. Just the way that they're referring, the archivist refers to him as Carl. I mean, just there's still clearly such a like cult of personality or mythology around Carl Hagenbeck at the zoo, even though his legacy is obviously really complicated for a whole host of reasons. So that was really fascinating to me. And I almost wonder if you can sort of draw that out even more, perhaps, like comparing how the zoo is reinventing itself or not, compared to sort of the broader, I don't know, broader approach to Hagenbeck. And I also wondered if you could even, I mean, I don't want to like totally simplify this, you know, Hagenbeck and his business, but I wonder if you could even just like emphasize more that for him, it really is a business. Like this is about money. He's the whole like wildlife capture and trading, and same with the displays of people at the zoo. Like it really is a like first and foremost a business for his zoo in a way that it isn't quite the same way for a lot of the other zoos that you mentioned in the first few pages of the draft. And in light of that, it's like also really interesting the way that the current staff is, you know, talking about the zoo and its history. So I just wanted to bring that up first. And then one tiny note is that on page 3, when you, at the bottom paragraph, when you talk about like the first zoological garden being for education, science, and conservation, I think the conservation piece, I know I totally know what you're saying, but I think conservation probably should maybe be taken out there, because that becomes more of the mission later on towards the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries, even though that's like primary message of zoos today. But yeah, I think this is really interesting stuff. So I'll just throw all of that out there.
Thanks, Sarah. I totally thought of you when I was writing that very section. And I have it in my kind of back of my head to just connect with you, and so that you can help me frame some of this. But also, obviously, as is clear by that last comment, I am still struggling to because this is a global book and things are happening at different times in different places, I'm having trouble deciding when to say certain things start or finish or end. And of course, none of them do. And so I'm finding that a challenge. As for your first point, or both of your other points, I did intend this to have that emphasis on the business. And if that's not coming through, I think that's something I'm going to go back and look at why not. Because I perhaps I've cut that out from earlier drafts, but it was certainly an emphasis I had, like the thing I wanted people to take away originally. The people show stuff is also there too, but also what you say about him being treated, you know, he's Carl, he's looking down upon us, he's this icon. It's complicated even further, right? For all the employees, because who's their boss, right? Their bosses are descendants of Carl, right? It's a family operation, which is, I think, something perhaps I should make a more clear point on. So that's a really, really useful piece of feedback. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you talk about the financial piece of the zoo here, but it's sort of a few pages in, so it's there, but it does. I think maybe if you open with a little bit more of that at first, it would be sort of more strongly emphasized. But yeah, I love what you were saying about like looking through the book of all the prices and everything.
Okay. Yeah. Let me take another look. Christina.
Yes, thank you. So what I'm interested in is the aspect of time, because also in your text you wrote about different buildings from different time levels, and especially the Thai temple. I think it's 15 years old or something like that. And but it sounds as if it was built in around 1910 maybe. And also the polar panorama, it wasn't bombed in the Second World War, but only a part of it. And it was demolished, I think, also 15 years ago. And only the South Pole panorama was bombed, and the other was demolished completely. And then, so I want to come to the point that this family tells a story about their own zoo and about their activities, like demolishing things, and about restorations which are made by zookeepers, for example. And so you have a zoo which has many time shifts on it, and especially then this family with the narratives, with their fights, their fights by lawyers, and these processes, and the family which still goes for big game hunt in Africa and shoot the animals to show. So there are so many narratives around this park which is still existing today. And yeah, I could continue the story, what else happens there, but there are, I think it's very interesting, kind of fascinating. So maybe it's not this pleasure, but it's the fascination to go beyond the bars, maybe, to have this insight into this company. And yeah, it's a question for me how to deal with this. And I don't know. Yeah,
I will admit ignorance on that often too. When sometimes I'll wake up and think this chapter is a book someone else has already written or needs to write. I mean, I pull so much from Rothfells. I wonder if I pull too much from Rothfells. I think I often think everything I'm trying to accomplish could actually all be done through the lens of Hagenbeck. So I'm definitely back and forth on whether, on the framing of this thing and how big it can be, because I have these restrictions of what I actually want the book to actually be. And I want it to echo, books like The Sixth Extinction, where we have a journalist in a place, but the chapters are really short and pithy and make the point and move on. And it's so bloody hard to make the point and move on about Hagenbeck, as so many of you guys have already pointed out. So I always tell my students, maybe when you're having a problem, maybe just insert that into the story. Maybe I should insert that fact into the story, that there's just so bloody much. There's so, I don't know how to fully articulate it. Maybe I keep coming back to him in the other chapters. Maybe I'm in Copenhagen and I have to talk about Hagenbeck again. Maybe that's an interesting way of, yeah, dealing with that sort of ubiquitousness. Mariana.
Yeah, to follow up on this, I think I agree with Gail, and I think you should dethrone Hagenbeck. I mean, come on, it's just like, if the whole book is going to be around Hagenbeck, I think it's a little bit too much. And also, I do agree that like highlighting more, even more, that it's a business, you know, the reason why, like, he's a self-made man. The reason why, you know, we believe that the panorama is innovative is because he said so, because he patented it. And he said it's innovative and it's totally new and no one ever done it before. Like, it's just, it keeps on coming back. And he's just a really, really good entrepreneur. And that's basically what Nigel also says in his book. I think that's the gist of it, that he's a really amazing promoter, coming in so many different roles, going in so many different shoes. You know, his memoir, the way you read it, the way it's written, it's just all there. And I thought that for me, your story with Bella, I read it as a kind of a shift, like away from Hagenbeck. But I think I would like to see more of that, of like, you know, if you are in the Hagenbeck Zoo and you talk about this particular orangutan, it's a really great device to kind of like turn the attention away from this whole creation of the familial, you know, structure of the Hagenbeck empire that seems like something of the past, but it seems like in this place it's still alive and kicking. And I think maybe you can use story of Bella and your discomfort in invading her space a little bit more to achieve that goal. And I think that would be super interesting. Yeah, so just wanted to say that. And I have also one small point, that when you write on page 11, that one before the last paragraph, you write that most directors of large zoological gardens at the turn of the 20th century were either zoologists or biologists, people who believed in presenting the natural world taxonomically in order to educate the public, but also to assist scientists who are beginning to churn out volumes of research conducted at zoos. Yeah, I think that it's in turn of the 20th century. It's like a difficult phrase, but more into the 20th century, there was a lot of research done in zoos, but like more at the end of the 19th century, actually not that much. So it might give a false impression that there was actually like a lot of research. That's what zoos were supposed to be. And of course, London Zoo is this typical scientific style zoo. But if you look at many other zoos, there wasn't like that much research coming out of them. So for that, you might want to see the work of Oliver Hochadel or Violette Pouliat, who kind of write about this. But yeah, so just to be like on the correct side, I would maybe like
thank you,
not say that they were churning out so many so much research at that time yet. It happens a bit later in time. So
this is why I'm so happy to have access to you guys' gigantic brains. This is yeah, I think that's a case of me trying to skip past, get on with things that I need to get on with, and summarizing in a misleading way. Can you throw those names in the chat for me, Mariana?
Yes, I will. And it's like totally normal because zoos are presenting, just like Hagenbeck, they're presenting themselves to be one thing, but then when you look at it, it's like if you record, like review a lot of you know, archival materials, and it's like, oh my God, it's not so much really. So it's totally normal to use this kind of shortcuts, but if you want to be precise, to stay on the safe side. Yeah,
and I have a whole chapter on London, which I think you've read, but also in other places. Like, I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid on this idea that this vast trove of incredibly valuable science has come out of zoos. I'm more pushing something out of the way to deal with later in the book. But thank you. That's all really, really useful. And I love that thought about Bella. I thought about bringing her back in the middle. I wanted to ground it in her. Using her as a bookend felt a bit not enough. So yeah, maybe that's the way to go. That's great. Thank you. Kari.
Yeah, I mean, just to well, let me first of all say that I think, like a lot of people have already mentioned, that you've kind of set yourself an unenviable task here, especially if you want to be pithy and then move on. But I think that the pithiness that you're aspiring to could also be very much an opportunity not to tell the story that we all know already, right? And I understand that this is going to be difficult, especially if this is for a sort of general readership who maybe aren't quite as immersed in the intricacies of.
They will have never heard of this. Yeah.
But I don't know. I think everybody has kind of heard of it, and even then, it's an opportunity for you to tell the story in a different way. And I think that it's how shall I, right? Everything about Hagenbeck is about situating the observer in a particular place so that you see only what Hagenbeck wants you to see. And the way that the zoo tells the story and the family continues to tell this particular story, I can imagine that it's really difficult not to get sucked in, right? You say you're not drinking the Kool-Aid, but I mean there isn't anything else on offer often, right? And so you end up kind of repeating the perspective that the zoo wants you to adopt, which is why I was kind of I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I understand it, but I also wonder why I think you had to go into that enclosure, right? And you had to see it from the other perspective, right? Just also to try and tell the story from a different viewpoint. And in that spirit, I mean, since you asked for kind of points, I would definitely not start with Rilke, because I think that this. I mean, I love Rilke and I love that poem and everything, but he's in Paris. It's a different thing, and this idea. Hagenbeck took the bars away, and what people really disliked about zoos was the bars and whatever. This is the story that everybody knows. This is the official kind of narrative, and I wouldn't lead with that. I think that it sets it up in a kind of very familiar pattern.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean. I mean, I understand why you went with that, but I think you have to find a different way in, in through the back door somehow
Yeah. I mean, I'm walking an impossible line where I'm trying to be the unbiased observer. I get the irony in that too, but I'm trying to be unbiased and allowing Nigel Rothfeld's work to speak that other narrative. And I'm gathering that's not coming across, and I'm gathering that some of that needs to come from me, which is an awkward position to be in, just in terms of how I envision this thing being, in terms of my position in it. But I'm gonna have to think about that. I understand completely what you're saying, and Bella becomes almost more of a device, not less one, in this new thinking around how to frame this. Because by taking the perspective of the animal, I can then complicate this narrative.
I think you should actually, Mariana just put this in, I think you should start with a hotel, or at least make sure that that's in there. I think, the elevator doors open and there's like African drums and everything's made of plastic and whatever, you are in some kind of, And if you haven't seen Nanette, you should definitely watch that film that Johanna mentioned.
Oh, yeah. I have not.
Which is about an orangutan in the Jardin des Plantes.
Okay, thanks so much, Kari. Margaret.
I unraised my hand, but didn't unmute. I think I'm kind of curious in this conversation and through reading the chapter, to what extent this chapter is about Hagenbeck, and to what extent this chapter is about the Hagenbeck Zoo, which now has been existing without Hagenbeck there for over 100 years, which I think it's hard to tease out, because it seems like there is this insistence at the Hagenbeck Zoo that the zoo is still about Hagenbeck, but actually they are two separate things, and it feels like maybe Bella's story is a way to make the story of this chapter more about the Hagenbeck Zoo existing after Hagenbeck. But then there's also this story about Hagenbeck himself. So I'm just curious about that, how much you want the chapter to be about the Hagenbeck, the man, and how much about the Hagenbeck Zoo, and sort of how that compares to the other chapters in the book also, if there are these other figures that are coming out so strongly, or if the other chapters are more focused on the institutions versus individual founders, maybe.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Margaret. I also feel to walk into that place, especially accompanied by the PR people and then the archivist, is to feel like time has stopped. It really is. It is to feel like what a lot of everyone else has been saying, which is that this narrative has been, you know, so cut into stone that it's all anyone says, and so it almost feels like time has stopped. And that's what made me feel like it's legitimate to bring all this up in a contemporary visit. And so I guess that's still where I sit on that. It feels like it, you know, the concept, the chutzpah, all that stuff from back then, it's still happening, right? Like it's in the DNA of the place. And so I didn't see much that was suggesting a kind of resistance to that thing that started 100 and some years ago. So I guess that's where I sit on that. I'm just checking out the chat. Yeah, foregrounding the document. Yeah, God, that was chilling, that stuff. Joanna.
Yeah, thank you very much. It seemed to me when you have been in that cage from Bella that there was no audience. But when you watch Ninette, you will immediately realize like how annoying the sound is for the animals. Even when you watch the trailer from Ninette, for 5 minutes, you basically get a headache. It's so incredibly loud. And I don't know, maybe you can, you know, add that too in your book, like how loud it is and what those animals have to suffer because of the loudness, the sound. But you asked about the human zoo, and I'm dealing with the human zoo myself in my habilitation project, and I think the human zoo is such a good example about how biopolitics work, because the liberal state is kind of dependent on educating the people implicitly without them realizing it, like invisibly, and in showing the population, like within the human zoo, the primitive other, those who are not normal, kind of implicitly shows the audience what is supposed to be normal. For example, like they were half naked, and of course that kind of showed the European audience, oh, you know, we are more civilized than being naked, and we have our sexuality under control and all of that. And so the zoo is an example of how biopolitics implicitly works. And we are, when I tell students or people about the human zoos, because not everyone is familiar with that, most of the people are shocked and disgusted and how could that be and all of that. But when you look at our society now, we live in a neoliberal society, and when I turn on trash TV, I see something that is not much different from the human zoo. Like when I turn on, I don't know, The Biggest Loser, Bachelor in Paradise, all those trash TV formats that are popular in the US, for example, too, or that are popular around the world, they all work with something, they all create something in the audience, which I would call, or the media studies call, downward comparison. Like somehow liberal or neoliberal states or countries need downward comparisons in order to function, because we need to see people who kind of act unnormal. Because, you know, when I turn on trash TV, I can always think of myself as better, because I'm not, I do not behave as badly as those who are shown in Big Brother or Bachelor in Paradise or whatever. So it gives me a kind of, you know, good feeling, and I can feel as normal. And it also teaches the audience about what is normal in our society. For example, when I watch the messy chaos, you know, I know, okay, I am not as messy as those people there. And it kind of tells me, okay, in our society, I have to be employed, I have to educate my children properly, I have to have my sexuality under control, I cannot have babies when I'm 14 and all of that. And so I'm thinking that we never really got rid of the human zoo. It might now be in a different shape, like we do not show blacks, for example, something that is abnormal, but I think there's a deep connection between liberalism and zoo and the exhibition of unnormal people. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I guess I would just say that all start thinking about stuff in much less complicated terms in my head. I find myself overwhelmed in terms of this book project and trying to scratch the surface of something that one should not just be scratching the surface of. Yeah, you know, there are so many books already about that subject, and it's just impossible for me to figure out how much that thing needs to be. But I appreciate everything you're saying. I hear that critique. I just might not be the one to make that full of critique, but I hear it. Sorry, my internet I'm getting signals that my internet really sucks. You're all frozen, but I could hear everything you said, Joanna. Just checking the chat.
There are two more.
Remind me to download the chat.
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah,
there are two more hands, and then I think we have to wrap this up. Marcella.
Hi. Thank you, Andrew, for this wonderful thing. It's a very brief comment, or maybe, I don't know, it's a suggestion, but when you talk about this conflict that you experience with, you know, bringing Hagenbeck to the front, but also kind of experiencing this fascination in the zoo, I think that's exactly, you know, even for people that are, you know, that have a critical, or a more critical gaze around all of these subjects, I think there is, or maybe there's a key in that precisely this business of the zoo works because that fascination that we experience, that's a very primeval fascination, I think. And in that sense, it's a very perverse, I mean, it's like the epitome of perverse, you know, execution of business that just draws upon our fascination, our desire, our need of proximity, and that's why 700 million people still go to zoo instead of just looking at David Attenborough films or other films, yeah, that involve animals.
Right. Yeah, I'm beginning from a lot of what you guys are saying, and especially Marcella, I'm beginning to sense just how much more loaded that moment is than I thought it was, where I'm standing at that door. And I just wonder if maybe there's a way to spend more time there, because these are all, like, when I'm not, it's a funny image, but I feel drawn in many directions, like I do in that picture of myself in the museum. Like I'm still adding layers to how I'm thinking about all of this, often through visiting with you guys once a year. So yeah, I wonder if there's even more there in that moment that I'm aware of, and a lot of what you're saying needs to be articulated because I'm feeling that. Sorry, I've had to turn my camera off, but thank you for that. And then I think we've got Louise.
That's right. I will just jump in quickly because I know we're right at the end. And I want to take you back to the question of form. And I think, I mean, this has come up in the discussion, but I wonder if you want to think seriously about experience as the way in which you frame this narrative. And I don't know if you've read Adorno's The Essay as Form. And what that essay does, I feel, it encourages you, or it describes a method of writing which doesn't feel that doesn't demand to be comprehensive. You don't have to write like the full story, the whole story. And instead you can write from your own perspective through a kind of mediation of your own experience. And because you've had this intriguing experience of going to the zoo, which includes standing in shit and the strange hotel, you know, and what it allows you to do is to bring together these very different kinds of experiences and use that to, in a sense, structure the narrative. And of course, that experience could include reading Rothfuss on Hagenbeck. So you don't have to do the work because he's already done it, as it were. And so that's quite a nice way of, I don't know, assembling a lot of very diverse things without feeling you have to tell the whole story of Hagenbeck.
Louise, I cannot thank you enough for saying what you just said. And my internet cut out, but I think you're talking about the essay as form. Yeah, so I teach the personal essay. I teach nonfiction writing to undergraduates, and we occasionally deal with that essay in C or D level classes. And I'm actually quite amazed at how you're putting your finger on something that, taking the pandemic break from this project, has made me really reconsider. Like, I wrote the thing you read, I wrote it 1.5 years ago. And it's been sitting there collecting dust and feeling unable in its form to reach what I want to reach. And simultaneously, when I finally had time to write, once the schools reopened for the 3rd time and my son was finally out of the house, I started writing a personal essay about the loss of my father-in-law last year, and the grief of the pandemic, and the grief of the loneliness of the virtual. And it took exactly the kind of form that you're talking about. Small little numbered sections. And I'd never written in that form before. I'd obviously taught it before. It was unbelievably liberating. And I less than 12 hours ago, I was above this room talking to my wife about, I wonder if this zoo thing should be more in that form. Because then it doesn't have to be a straightforward, this led to this, led to this. You know, I'm not trying to be Elizabeth Colbert going to all the most amazing places to teach you about climate and the extinction crisis, but instead it's more about one mind trying to sort its way through all of this. Because of course, that's what a great personal essay does. You feel like you're in the company of a mind that's curious and figuring stuff out. So I'm really going to take what you just said to heart, because it's really resonating with where I'm at like tomorrow with this. So thank you for that. How do my students get to hear this stuff and then I don't remember it? Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if other teachers in the room feel that way, but I found so much of what I tell my students, I forget. Constantly telling them to try new forms and innovate what they think they should be doing. Anyway, thank you, Louise.
Okay, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Andrew, do you have anything you want to say in the end, or?
No, this has just been so enormously helpful. Thank you for thank you for everything, and for being kind with me as well.
That's what we're here for. Okay, so we should well, thanks to Andrew and to Matthew for these presentations. That was the workshop. Big round of applause, yes, and so on. And now, well, we're half an hour into the final concluding discussion. The question is whether we want to have the concluding discussion right now, or whether we want to take a 5-minute break and then have the concluding discussion. Votes for taking a break? No votes. Oh, 1, 2. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be, let's sort of.
Just don't flake off, come back.
Don't flake off, come back. There'll be important information after this message from our sponsors. Okay, so see you back here, and I don't know if.
Sorry.
Yes.
How do you download the chat?
You hit the 3 dots next to the smiley face and say download chat.
Ah, save chat. Well, that was easy. Thank you.
Okay, see you back here in a minute.